Nú ætlum við að venda okkur kvæði í kross og sýna viðtal sem ég átti við Noam Chomsky. Hann hefur nú verið kallaður áhrifamesti þjóðfélagsrýnir samtímans, the most influential public intellectual, og það eru fleiri en einn fjölmiðill sem hafa gefið honum slíkar einkunnir. Þetta frægur maður, hann er upprunalega málfræðingur, prófessor við Massachusetts Institute of Technology, setti fram kenningar málfræði sem eru umdeildar en hafa haft gríðarlega áhrif, en svo hann líka þjóðfélagsrýnir og hefur verið að beitt sér á því sviði í alveg síðan á tíma Víetnamstríðsins. Hann telur held ég sjálfan sig vera helst anarkista, ef eitthvað er, en við reyndum að fara svona nokkuð vítt og breitt yfir heimsmálin og þess að geta að Chomsky kom hingað í boði hugvísindasviðs Háskóla Íslands. Það er svona í tengslum við 100 ára afmæli Háskólans og ég kann þeim mjög góða þökk fyrir að aðstoða mig við að koma Chomsky hingað í þátt hjá mér og í viðtal. En Noam Chomsky, gjörðu svo vel. So Professor Chomsky, it so happens that we are speaking, well, this will be broadcast on 11th of September. So it's exactly 10 years since we had the attacks in New York. And now people wonder what is the legacy, what's the meaning of these attacks now that in hindsight?
Well, it was obviously a horrifying terrorist act, maybe the single worst terrorist, what we call terrorist act ever. But it was very unusual also. The reason it was unusual was because of the direction in which the guns were pointing. This is the first time that the United States has, U.S. territory has been attacked since 1814, when the British burned down Washington. We only attack others. They don't attack us. In fact, more generally, from the point of view of the West altogether, it's the first time there's an attack that came from anywhere but another Western country. You know, again, these are things we do to others. They don't do them to us. And that, of course, is a matter of great significance. That's why it's called in the West the day that changed the world forever. Yes. And in fact, there was, if you look over the world reactions, there was sympathy and concern everywhere. But in a good deal of the world, the reaction was, this is horrible, we're sorry you underwent this, join the club. This is what you've been doing to us for centuries. And in fact, it's rather striking, because if you go to Latin America, this is called the second 9/11. There's a first 9/11, which is gone from the consciousness of the West, because we did it to them. That's September 11th, 1973, which by any realistic dimension was considerably worse than what we call 9/11. And you can see that quite easily. As you know, I'm sure, one of the planes, the Al-Qaeda planes, was downed by passengers, very courageous passengers, managed to take control of the plane and crashed in Pennsylvania. It didn't make it to its target, which was Washington. Well, suppose that plane had hit its target, which could have been the White House. Suppose that they'd hit the White House, killed the president. Suppose that there had been a pre-planned military uprising, which took place and established a military dictatorship, overthrowing the democratic regime. And suppose it then killed thousands of people, tortured tens of thousands of people, established a major terror center in Washington, which was carrying out assassinations, overthrowing governments all over much of the world. Suppose they brought in a group of economists who, within a couple of years, drove the country to one of its worst economic crises in history, and on. That would have been worse than what did happen, and it did happen. Yeah. It happened on the first 9/11. It was an event, as Henry Kissinger told President Nixon, of no historic significance. It's, of course, the U.S.-initiated and U.S.-backed overthrow of the parliamentary regime in Chile and the installation of the Pinochet regime. The only thing that's wrong in the analogy that I just mentioned is that the numbers should be multiplied by about a factor of 25 to make it per capita equivalent.
But we never had, well, we had Abu Ghraib, we had Guantanamo, we had Iraq, we had Afghanistan, but we never had this clash of civilization that was talked about.
And actually, if you look at 9/11, the clash of civilizations was partly manufactured. I thought then, and I think there's much more evidence now, that there were much better alternatives. In fact, if you look at the specialists on Al-Qaeda, like Michael Scheuer, the CIA agent who'd been in charge of tracking Al-Qaeda for years, he's written about it, first anonymously, now recently he's exposed himself. He says that George Bush was just following bin Laden's script. He said the United States has been Al-Qaeda's best ally. Al-Qaeda's plan was, their hope was to convince their the potential constituency. They regard themselves as a vanguard which wants to mobilize a constituency. Constituency is the Muslim world. And they were trying to convince them that the United States is on a crusade to attack Islam. You take a look at polls now. In fact, an international poll just came out a couple of weeks ago. There's fear and anger at the United States because of the feeling that they're attacking Islam. Bin Laden won a victory. And there were alternatives. At the time, the 9/11 attack was harshly criticized within the jihadi movement, very harshly. I could go through the details if you like, but some of the leading clerics were extremely critical. And it would have been possible at that time, I think, but more significantly, specialists on the topic think, like Fawaz Gerges, that it would have been quite possible to isolate the militant jihadi movement at the time and bring the Muslim world, almost all of it, into support for wiping out this militant tendency. Instead, it's escalated enormously. And in fact, the actions that were taken very consciously increased terror. So, for example, the invasion of Iraq, we now know from testimony at the British Chilcot inquiry, into the background, and material from intelligence services, that both the CIA and British intelligence, and in fact French intelligence, predicted that if the U.S. invaded Iraq, it would increase terrorism. It did, by a factor of 7 in the first year, according to government statistics. These are victories for bin Laden, as are the roughly $4 trillion expenses for the 2 wars, and maybe double that for Homeland Security. I mean, he never expected he's going to conquer the United States. The plan was to bankrupt the United States, to trap it, to bring it into what was called a trap.
So he was largely successful?
He was very largely successful. It's not just my view, incidentally. You can read people like Scheuer and other specialists on Al-Qaeda who say exactly that.
So American power was undermined by the whole affair?
It was undoubtedly undermined. I mean, there's no question that it's weaker now than it was 10 years ago. And this is not the only factor, but it's one factor.
But what happened while they were looking at the Middle East, at the Islamists, was that China rose. They actually...
Well, that's part of it, but that's, I think, exaggerated. Yeah, the rise of China is, of course, significant, but the idea that power is shifting from, the U.S. to China, I think, is a gross exaggeration. China is a very poor country, which faces all sorts of difficulties. Go through it if you like, but... there has been spectacular growth, but they have internal problems that the West totally non-existent in the West. And in fact, China itself, its economic growth, if you take a look at it, it's primarily as an assembly plant. So there's a lot of concern in Europe and the United States about the trade deficit with China. But when the trade deficit, I don't know about Europe, in the United States, where it's been calculated accurately in terms of value added, turns out that the trade deficit with China goes down about 25%, and it goes up with Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, about 25%. I mean, they're supplying the advanced parts and components, the high technology, as is the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
And it's being assembled in China and then shipped out. Actually, there's some careful studies of it, and they're pretty interesting.
So you think these ideas of well, Chinese world dominion are exaggerated?
That's an illusion. I mean, look, they're per capita. Take a look at the Human Development Index of the United Nations. It comes out every year. China, the last time I looked, was ranked about 90th, I think, right next to El Salvador, a Dominican Republic. It's a very poor country, and it has enormous internal problems, unrest, labor strife, ecological problems. It has a major demographic problem, which is well known to analysts. The Chinese growth period, the last roughly 20 years, had a huge demographic bulge in young people ages roughly 20 to 40, the basic workforce. That's over. It's now declining. So that demographic benefit that they had is going to be a thing of the past pretty soon, plus many other factors. So yes, it was a spectacular growth period, and there are other aspects of it that aren't really too well recognized outside of the technical literature. So take, say, mortality. There's been a very sharp decline in mortality in China, but it was during the Maoist years. The decline was sharp from 1950 to about 1980, and it was very sharp because of rural hygiene, health programs, barefoot doctors, hygiene. Starting from 1980, it's leveled, and by now mortality rate is actually higher than it was in 1980. It's a complicated story. It's not the way the ideology presents it, and you find it very quickly as soon as you look into the details.
I'd like to speak about President Obama. Well, he was voted in with hope, but why is he such a disappointment?
Because the hope was a complete illusion. I don't say that in retrospect. Even before the primaries, I was writing about him, just using his record and his website. And it was very clear that this is public relations. In fact, the public relations industry knows it. You may know that shortly after the election, every year the advertising industry gives a prize for the best marketing campaign of the year.
Yes.
He won. He beat out Apple computers.
Yes.
And if you read the business press, like, say, the London Financial Times, major business press, they were quoting executives who were completely euphoric. They said, we have a new model for public relations, for deceiving the public. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms and so on. So yes, they understood perfectly well. He won primarily because he did receive the largest, by far the largest support from the financial institutions. That's kind of the core of the economy now. In 2007, they actually had 40% of corporate profits, and they preferred him. So they poured money in, and elections in the United States are mostly bought. You can predict almost completely who's going to win an election just by looking at campaign funding.